Thank you for joining me. I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked. You can't have a successful career without knowing how to deal with the unexpected, and Unlocked is here to help you do that. If you're a person who sets goals that challenge you to reach your full potential, this show is for you. This is a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. You can learn more about the show on my website, madelineblair.com/unlockedtv. And there you can also see all of the earlier shows. And if you have a topic idea or a question, just email me to madeline@madelineblair.com. Often when I get those ideas, I follow up, and we've had shows on that were specific to the responses that I got. Now, if you're curious about the background of this show, check out my book, Unlocked: Discover How to Embrace the Unexpected. It's available on Kindle, audio, and paperback. If you would like to explore what it means to build and nurture your resilience with me as your mentor, reach out directly to me to schedule a conversation. Again, write to madeline@madelineblair.com, and be sure to sign up for my mailing list at my website. My free video series, 3 Strategies for Building Resilience, has already begun, but you are not too late to sign up by going to my website, madelineblair.com, and scroll down to Current Announcements on the homepage and click on the link provided. It's a long link, so I'm not going to read it, but if you manage to get there, you'll find it. All right. Our topic today is stories are how we think. 25 years ago, if I used the word story, you would think I was talking about children's stories. Now, thanks to many of my colleagues, and I put myself in that category too, you probably know that story is used in business for many purposes, from sharing a vision to making a sales call. Today, we're going to dive even more deeply into the magic of story and its ability to form not only us, but everyone around us. You know, Thomas Jefferson said, "No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth, and no culture comparable to that of the garden." Okay, I know. He's talking about a garden, not a community or society or even a team. But I like that he is talking about culture in the sense of taking care of. He's likely considering what plant for the given soil, temperature, rain, sunshine. But are there similar levers for culturing a community? I'd like to talk about one lever that is so powerful that we tend to overlook it, and that lever is story. In our history, we tell many, many stories of the lonesome cowboy out on the range by himself. That character existed only for about 40 years in our history. Yet the image is so firmly fixed in our minds that we strive for that kind of independence, a state that is very hard to achieve for a lifetime. It's mythic. There is another story in our history called the immigrant story, of coming to this country to achieve a better life for the person and their family. In contrast, their stories span hundreds of years and continue to do so even today. From these stories, we see ourselves as a place of opportunity, regardless of who you are. And we know that the opportunity is still there. It's just not necessarily evenly distributed. Yet, it is believed as truth. Stories form us. They tell us who we are, how to act, what to expect, and more. The question becomes, how do we harness these stories so that we can understand ourselves better and our culture better? And can we discover how to change the stories we tell to change our culture and our lives? Dr. Ed Hoffman, the former chief knowledge officer of NASA, joined me in an exploration about stories changed NASA. Let's see, I should put up, we're doing explorations and again, do a little bit more explaining on this. The question that brought a real story, the question that brought real insight for the application of story began with how Dr. Ed brought story into NASA. So let's join the conversation.
To establish a project management academy. This was a few years after the first space shuttle disaster, Challenger, for the beginning of the 90s. And how do you train people? How do you prepare people who've been to the moon? That was still the generation that had been there. And what I started noticing that the best leaders, the best trainers, if you will, the best people for learning, they would tell stories. They didn't use a lot of slides. They would tell stories, and that was what everyone locked into, and they wanted more and more stories. And so we saw that. And one of the things we decided we would do, and partly with our joint friend Denise Lee, we started coming up with the notion of let's bring people together in communities and networks. And so we would invite 25, 50, and we would prearrange a few of the people, a few of the project practitioners. It could be managers, it could be acquisition people, it could be people to tell stories. 10 to 15 minutes, no slides, tell about a project that they were working where there were a lot of challenges. And it could have ended up successful or unsuccessful, just tell the story. And then in the tables, we would listen to a few of these people, and then we would discuss it at the tables. What did we learn? Can I relate to your problem? Can I relate to the solution? Do I see the lessons? What are they? And we found that people loved the stories, and they loved then coming up with their conclusions of what have they learned from that. And they were different. It was very different experience doing those story forums than it was doing any kind of training. And I realized that training is about telling people, this is what we know, this is what you need to learn to do. Story is we can disagree, and we can get to a place just naturally.
There's another thing about story is that it brings out the knowledge that we already have. Yeah. And it reminds us that we have the knowledge. I know I went into one organization, they wanted me to talk about teamwork. And I looked at them and I said, well, tell me some stories about when you were working well with the team. Well, they all knew what it took to make an effective team. And it came out in their stories. And we just gathered that. And there it was. And of course, the client was disappointed because I wasn't telling them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to come up with a 5-point plan that tells people what to do. But no, you're absolutely right. It's so powerful. I had some of the folks I had in the room would never typically go to training in those days. They were senior leaders. They were probably 30 years in. And I remember at the end of the first section, first knowledge forum, we call them, I had several of these senior leaders, senior project folks coming towards me. And I wondered, okay, what's going to happen now?
What's going to happen now? Well, we're going to get back to what the leaders at NASA said about the use of stories after we talk with our guest today, Cynthia Kurtz. Cynthia, welcome to Unlocked. And thanks so much for joining me.
I'm glad to talk to you.
Well, let me tell the audience a little bit about you. Cynthia F. Kurtz is a consultant, researcher, software developer, and author. Originally an ethologist, she discovered organizational narrative in 1999 at IBM Research, where she worked to help IBM develop internal and client services centered around organizational stories. She built on that work at IBM's Institute for Knowledge Management and at the consulting firm Cognitive Edge before launching her independent consultancy in 2009. Cynthia has consulted on over 100 narrative projects for clients in government, for-profit, and nonprofit sectors. She has worked with IBM, obviously, Berkeley, Singapore Police Force, Coca-Cola, and many more. Today, she's the author of the textbook, Working with Stories in Your Community or Organization, Participatory Narrative Inquiry. And yes, we are going to find out what that means. And also, she's the author of a companion software, Nara Firma. Both are widely considered vital resources in the field of participatory story work. She offers both of these free to others who wish to learn and use stories. She's also the author of Confluence. Again, welcome, Cynthia, to Unlocked, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I know that we want to get those links out to people, but maybe we'll do that a little bit later in the show, if that's all right with you. Well, let's begin. I mean, your background is a remarkable path of interest to exploration, to application, to interest, to exploration, to application. It's amazing what you've done. I often ask teens to offer questions from their perspective, and today I want to start with one of their questions. Cynthia, what can you tell us about your personal story?
Well, let's see. I would say that it's not so much a path of, the way you described it makes it sound on purpose. A lot of my career path has been accidents, failure, recovery. Basically, that's been most of it. I think that the main thing is I don't give up. I'm very dogged, and I will just stick with things, even when they're not working. So, yes, I was very interested from a young age in behavior and in social behavior. Why do social groups form? How does it all work? And I think that probably that comes from just being socially anxious. I wanted to figure everybody out. But I was also very intensely curious about animals. I loved animals. And I grew up in the country, in the woods, and I just loved to pay attention to animals. So I studied ethology, which is the study of animal behavior and the evolution of behavior, and did that for 9 years. And then a bunch of unpleasant things happened, and I had to quit doing that. So that was one of my first failures. And then I kind of didn't know what to do next, and I ran into my husband, and we said, hey, he wanted to make educational software. And I said, sure, sounds like fun. So we did that for several years, and then that failed because we ran out of money. And we said, well, let's see what comes next. And so I bumbled into this job as a tech writer at IBM because, well, there was a job, and that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. And they just happened to be studying stories in organizations. And I discovered that that's kind of behavior and social behavior. And I was like, hey, I like this. And so that was 23 years ago. And I've been doing that ever since. So that's the story.
You know, I love the stories that my guests tell, because invariably there is this little crazy kink in it. And suddenly, you know, it's like you got through a door and now you're where you're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And for you, Cynthia, I can really see it, your doggedness and your persistence, because what you're working on really takes that. It's not straightforward. You really have to stay with it. Well, I promised people we would begin to parse out that phrase, narrative participatory inquiry. But I want to begin with talking about Paul Costello, who defines narrative as the collection of all of our individual stories. Now, for our conversation, I think it'd be useful for you to briefly define what you mean by story versus narrative.
Okay. I don't know why, but I really like etymology, the history of words. And so I tend to go by that a lot. So if you look at the word story, it comes from an ancient word that meant witness, or a person who was there and saw what happened. And so it was history was the word story was just a shortening of the word history as an account of events. And it was only fairly recently that it became to be used to mean both real events and fictional events. So that's where that word kind of comes from. But narrative comes from a completely different history. It came from a root having to do with knowledge and having to do with explaining things and passing on knowledge. So a narrative is an explanation. It's an explanation of the way things are and how they got to be that way. Now, it may contain stories within it, and he's right, it does contain stories, but there are other elements of narrative as well, such as music, art, dance, cultural rituals. Many different things are part of the narratives that we have that explain things. So I see narrative as much bigger than story, as he does, but I include some other stuff in it as well.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for that. I love how how words come about too. I've often looked those up. But I never did it with story and narrative. I've done it with a lot of words, but never those. So thank you for that.
That's cool.
Okay, we promised participatory narrative inquiry. Let's parse that out a bit and tell people what that means.
Okay. Can I call it PNI, because I have such a hard time saying that whole long thing.
Thank you.
Okay. What it is that it's a marriage of two fields. And I see this in retrospect. I mean, I only came up with that name after 10 years of doing the work. Roughly. But the one side of it is the academic field of narrative inquiry. And in that field, researchers go out, they find people that they call them informants, and they ask them a lot of questions and gather stories from them. Then they take those stories, and as experts, they interpret them, they figure out what they mean, and they build theories, etc. And they write papers and publish books and everything. And the people who told the stories usually never go back to those people. And that's a perfectly reasonable form of research. It's been around for a long time. But when I first started working with stories, right around that same time, I discovered this thing called action research. And action research is this really exciting body of work, which says that when you're working with human beings, and this was a revelation to me because I previously worked with animals, you can't just research them. When you talk to somebody, when you ask them questions, you've already made changes just by asking them questions. They're going to see the thing you're talking about differently just because you ask them the questions about it. So what they say is research is action and action is research. And they also say that when you have the traditional research has the people who are researched, the people who are do the research, the researchers, and then you have the people who are researched for, that is, who pay for it or who let it happen, and that those three groups are entirely separate. They don't communicate. People don't belong to more than one group. But in action research, they bring them all together into one group of co-researchers. So when I first discovered this, I was like, this is it. I want to do this. This is so exciting. Yeah. But here's the funny thing. In participatory action research, sometimes people put that word on, sometimes they don't. There's very little storytelling. There's not a lot of story work in participatory action research. And so I kind of married these two fields together. And this, I say I, but I was working with a lot of other people at the time. I've continued to work with a lot of other people the whole 23 years of doing this. They just keep changing over time. But these two fields come together. And so in PNI, what we do is we take the techniques that the experts use in narrative inquiry and we bring them to the people. So the people themselves interpret their stories, figure out what they mean, work with them in groups, and kind of come to the insights that they can come to themselves. And the researcher is more a facilitator than a researcher. Facilitators make things easy. The French word facile means easy. So facilitators make things easier for other people. And so when you do PNI, what you are is you're a conduit to making things easier for other people. So that's the sort of basis of the whole thing.
It reminds me of how early feminist research said we have to be in the action, not removed from it, in order to really understand what's happening. And the enormous pushback from classical scientists,
who
felt that was inappropriate, and the the I remember when I was learning about this myself, and I'll never forget, one of my instructors said to me, but you have to understand, Madeline, when we talk about objective science, it was because in the beginning, we were researching the stars and we knew we couldn't change the stars. And I thought, I'll be darned, that's where objective comes from. But here we are as human beings, definitely in interaction all the time. So, good. I knew our conversation was going to be interesting.
I do too.
You know, in her amazing book, 365 Alive, Mary Alice Arthur writes, I define a story activist as someone who works with the stories of people, places, and things to discover and activate their greatest potential. She further says that we should ask which stories help you thrive. Where are your stories keeping you stuck? What story could liberate you? Where can story help you to move first to new ground and from there to higher ground? I mean, her list, of course, goes on and on because she's such a great thought leader. How does this relate to the work that you do in participatory narrative inquiry?
I think it relates. It definitely, I mean, that's pretty much a good description of what I do, except I think there are two little differences, but they're probably minor. Mm-hmm. One is I would think that instead of a story activist, I think I'm kind of more of a revivalist, meaning that people have been sharing stories with each other for who knows how long, maybe tens of thousands of years. And that we've always known how to do this, and we're always doing it, whether we know it or not. But we have kind of lost some of the skills that we used to have around this, mostly because storytelling has become so commercialized, and we've become very good audiences. But we've lost some of the ability to play a part in the exchange of stories as a community process and a group process. So I'm kind of interested in bringing that back, reskilling our whole society in getting better at the things we used to do well. And I think the other difference is that Mary Alice is talking a lot about which stories in the work that the P&I work that I do, it tends to be patterns among stories. It tends to be clusters of stories, groups of stories that people work with, and they find meaning in the juxtapositions and the connections among the stories. And I'm sure that she would say that that's important, but in my work, that's kind of like the most important thing. It's not a single story. It's a lot of stories usually.
So, for example, it might be a cluster of stories around how people are promoted.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that you then begin to parse out those stories and see what really it means to be promoted and the levers that are used. Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, now, in your work, your Working with Stories book, you compare stories to seeds because they pack a lot in a very small package that can be transmitted and stored, then retrieved. I loved that metaphor. I wonder, what is it about stories that really help societies become more vibrant? I mean, because what you describe here is life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I should say that my metaphors are all ecological because that's where I came from. So other people would make other metaphors. But anyway, the question of how do stories help communities, I have kind of three questions to that. And this is based on research I did quite a long time ago, that there are three dimensions of story. The first one I call story form, which is the story as a communication package. And as you talked to, and that's why I think of it like a seed. It's like a thing we make. And if you said to somebody, here's what I think, this is my opinion, they might accept it or attack it, right? But if you say, this is the experience I had, this is what it felt like to me, then it's like a gift. You can't just destroy it. When you go to a movie, we talk about the suspension of disbelief, right? That in the context of that movie, you kind of buy into the fact that in this movie, there are talking animals and they live in space or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing happens when you're talking to a friend and they're telling you how they felt about this thing that happened to them. Now, You might have not felt that way. You might think that this is ridiculous, right? But you have a suspension of disbelief while they're telling the story. And that's why stories are this negotiation device. We use it to communicate our feelings to other people. And the story's form supports that. The fact that their stories are put together in the way they are supports that communicative function. So that helps societies to basically talk to each other, reveal things that are hard to talk about, right? So the second dimension of story is story function, which means the cognitive aspects. We use stories to make sense of what's going on and what might happen, what might not happen, what we want to happen, what we don't want to happen. And we use stories to sort of figure out what we're going to do next, both individually and collectively. So when you get a bunch of people together and they're working with their stories, this is what they're doing. They're thinking together using stories. And it's like that NASA guy said before, that you know, it's a way of thinking through things that's different from making lists and arguing positions and all of that. It's not better, it's complementary. They both work together. And then the third aspect of story, the third dimension, is, I call it phenomenon. So it's form, function, phenomenon. It's easy to remember. And that one is the stories build connections. They build bonds between people.
They do indeed.
So when I share my stories with you and you share your stories with me in response, we feel connected in a way we weren't before. And that helps societies by bringing people together. Now, I have to say one other important thing, which is that all three of these dimensions have their dark sides. So story form, these packaged stories can be used to manipulate people, and they can be used to lie. That's propaganda. Well, not all propaganda is lies, but some is. And story function, stories can be used to confuse people, to stop them making sense of things, and to insert things into their minds that they should have more freedom to choose, right? And story phenomenon can be used to hate people who are outside your group. There are lots of stories that are told to exclude people. So I always think of stories as like fire, right? Fire warms us. We have a fireplace in our house. It keeps us warm. It's wonderful heat, but it can also burn down our house and kill us. And anyone who has worked with fire, has sat around a fire, they know that those two things exist at the same time. And if you want to work with stories, you have to be aware of both sides of it and be aware of both the power and the danger of working with stories.
You put that rather succinctly. You're absolutely right. We can abuse the magic that a story has within it. And I say magic, and it's the power, I guess is a better way to say that.
Mm-hmm.
It's true, because we do suspend, when you know you're listening to a story, you have to open your mind so that you hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
And in opening your mind, you've reduced the filters that it has to go through. I also, I'm thinking about the title of our conversation, which is "Story is How We Think." I wonder if you would expand on that just a little bit, tease that out a bit, because to me it is so natural to describe something in a particular way. But is that the only thing that means that it's how we think?
I'm not sure. I don't understand the question.
All right, let's try again. If I want to tell you something, I may say to you, I went to the store and I got a loaf of bread and I came home and it was the wrong kind of bread. I mean, that's a story.
Mm-hmm.
It's told as a series of events. But that's not necessarily a story. How is it that you are saying that story is how we think?
Well, every story is a chosen set of events. Probably a lot of other things happen that you didn't mention, see?
Yes.
And you curated those things in order to put together this package. And that package had meaning to you and purpose. So when you say Did you say there wasn't any bread, or you forgot to get it?
No, I got the wrong kind.
You got the wrong kind of bread. Now, there's things in there, like you're thinking about, why did I do that? I'm always doing that, right? Or why is the bread not labeled better? Or, there are reasons there are always reasons that we tell stories. We just don't really think about it. We're unaware of it a lot. But I should say that when I said stories are how we think, that's kind of the function dimension, and I like that one. So I think about it a lot. I like them all, but that's one that's particularly interesting to me because I've always been interested in how we make sense of things, how we make decisions.
Yeah.
Decision making, decision support has always been a big part of my interest. So stories are also how we communicate, and stories are how we connect. So, and also there are other things we do to think that are not stories. We do lots of things. Stories are just one of the ways we think, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I accept that. Well, speaking of how we connect with one another, there is a man by the name of Peter Block. For those who don't know who Peter Block is, he was known for a book many years ago called Flawless Consulting. But he's written many other things since then, and most recently, one called Community, the Structure of Belonging. And he says in there, it's important to shift our conversations from problems of a community to the possibility of community. I think that's such an interesting contrast. We do tend to talk about the problems of working together. It's hard because people are different. But to shift that to, well, because they're different, what are the possibilities that come out of that? We rarely talk about companies as communities, yet both are made up of people who are trying to work together. So how can your work open up the possibility of community?
I think the most important word you said there were open up. And because I think that's what I've seen happen when people start sharing stories with each other. Things open up that were closed before. And it isn't always possibilities. Sometimes it's problems, and sometimes it's problems and possibilities all intermesh so tightly that you can't pull them apart. And in fact, that's usually how they are. But the thing is, the great thing about stories is that's okay. There's supposed to be conflicting stories. Stories are one of the ways in which we explore conflict without resolving it. So you can have a story in which there are conflicts that never get resolved, and it's still a good story, and it's still an interesting, useful story. So, sometimes conflicts get resolved, but not always. Or you can have two counterposing stories, whatever you call it, counter stories, which you don't have to resolve that tension. It just stays right there. There it is, And where was I saying? Opening up is that if you ask somebody, what is your opinion about X? They're going to give you their sort of poker face opinion, their prepared thing. They're going to choose very carefully what they're going to say. But if you say, could you tell me about the last time you felt like, this? They're going to tell you something completely different. Now, they're still going to choose carefully what they're going to say, but it's a different thing. It's a thing that is more revealing because of that bubble, because of that suspension of disbelief. They're going to be able to tell you things they couldn't tell you when they were doing the opinion thing. And so what that does is it opens things up more. And when you get a bunch of people doing that, sharing these stories with each other and looking at the stories together, possibilities open up, even though there are problems intermingled that weren't available before.
As you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, this is a perfect description of how you can make a community more resilient, because the more possibilities you have to choose from, the more resilient you become. Because you get hit with something. All right, here's a possibility. Oh, great. Well, I hate to change the subject, but this is so interesting. But I do want to give you a chance to talk about your books. One is called Working with Stories, and another one is called Confluence. I wonder if you just talk a little bit about each of them. What are you trying to accomplish with them? Who are your audiences?
Okay. Well, you haven't changed the subject because it's the same stuff. Okay. So working with stories it teaches you how to do participatory narrative inquiry. It's just from beginning to end, and it's a long book. It's too much. It's the way I do things. I am now working on the 4th edition of the book, and as part of that, I'm writing a simplified version of the whole thing. It's mostly done. It'll be out on the web pretty soon. And anyway, I just spit out everything I knew about how to do it because it wanted out of my head, and it was banging on the doors for years, and so I let it out, and I'm still letting it out. And Confluence is a book about complexity and about dealing with complexity in the world. And it's another thing that kind of got stuck in my head and wanted out again. So I wrote a book, and it's now available to everybody. So, and that is very similar to working with stories in the sense that it has exercises in it that you can do in a group to make sense of complex things that are happening in your community or organization or family or team or whatever. The audiences for both books are basically everybody. It's just, I think anyone can benefit from all of this work. And, people do these PNI projects that are huge, that involve thousands of people over years, but you can also do a project in a room with 3 people for an hour. And people can just get started with it doing that. And what a lot of people do is they look at the book, they look at all the stuff I have, and they kind of pick and choose, and they kind of say, I like this, I'm going to try this, and they try different things, and everyone develops their own way of doing it. And I love that. And people bring their own ingenuity to it. Yeah. And I'm really excited about growing the field of PNI and getting more and more people involved in it. We have a discussion group where we get together once a month to talk. It's called the Participatory Narrative Practitioners Network. People look that up. We really want to build a community. We're building a community around doing this kind of work. Let's see, what am I trying to accomplish? Yeah, I'm trying to just help everyone do this, basically.
What strikes me as amazing is we said 10 years of your work, of your life has been in creating this book, working with stories, and yet you offer it free to people.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just a kind of a zealot for the gift economy. All my software is free too. And it's something my husband and I really care a lot about. We've put loads and loads of money into it. And I don't know, it's just who we are, that we like that.
Well, I'm going to give our audience some links so that if they're really interested and curious, I'm not going to read these. Well, maybe I will read them. One is, I can't read it. CFKurtz.com /PNI
Practicum. That's an online course that I'm giving, a couple of different online courses, and that's basically how I'm paying for all the free stuff. Because I do consulting, but that's kind of hit and miss. So I'm doing these courses now, and we're doing the second run through now, and it's really going great. And I'm so proud of everybody. They're doing projects, and they're learning a lot, and it's fun.
Oh, that's great. And why don't you read the next one?
Working with Stories, that's the book. You can download it from there. You can also buy a print or Kindle version of it. And then Terra Firma is the software that you can use to do this.
Okay. Fabulous. Thank you. Well, I want to push us just a little bit more because I want to get to where people can really see some examples in their minds. Mm-hmm. I know that you've heard of people who've done it on their own, people who've worked with you. Give us just a couple of stories of how people have done it.
Okay. Well, it's hard to pick because there are many, many stories. I think one that's kind of easy to understand and nice to tell about is one that I did way, way back in IBM in the very, I think it was the second year I was doing this, and I learned an awful lot on it. I made tons of mistakes, so you don't have to. This was a project where they have, in IBM, of course, in IBM research, they do a lot of patents or patents. And the process of doing that, of going through the documentation, getting the patent, is very involved and complicated. And there's a lot of esoteric, weird, stuff to it. And I was working with the people who supported the research organization, and they wanted to develop better learning resources to help people do this. So we gathered a lot of the older people in the research facility who knew a lot about this process, who've been doing it for 40 years or whatever. And we got them, it took a lot of effort, and we learned a lot. We got them to open up and tell us about all of their learning in doing this. And one of the things we learned was that it's really good to mix people who know a lot with people who know very little. Because if the people who know a lot are talking to each other, they just say, yeah, you know how it is, and you don't get much. But if you put them together with the people who don't know much, then there's a lot of crosstalk. They really bring out the stories. So anyway, we collected a lot of stories from these people. We learned so much about it. And then we built, I say we, but I was mostly the people I was working with. They built this learning resource for everybody at research who was doing this work. And it was a lot of how-to stuff, a lot of, how to do this step, what can go wrong, etc. But every single lesson in this learning resource had stories connected to it. And what they saw happen was once they put this out and people started using it, is that people they'd look up, how do you do this? And then they'd say, oh, what's this thing here? And then they look at the story and they say, oh, that's interesting. And then oh, look, there's more stories. And then they just go to town. They read all the stories. And they just get this great sense of how the whole thing worked that they didn't. And so this parallel structure of the facts and the stories really worked well together to give them the whole picture of it.
One of the things that really comes out of what you said was that you can't tell a story without telling the context of the story.
Yes.
And oftentimes we think that in a company, we're learning something because we know that if we put 3 bolts here, it works. Well, it's 3 bolts on what's the context? Is it underwater? Is it in the air? Is it in salt? I mean, is so many, the context would affect whether those 3 bolts really do work or not. And I love the fact that as you described it, you're getting lots of stories and that people really get excited when they see the context as well as the outcome. Which leads me to, I think it's going to be my last question, except maybe give you a chance to do some final words. But my audience is people who are in their careers and they want to be able to say, what can I do? How can I take these wonderful stuff that Cynthia is talking about? How can I apply it for myself? I don't mean directly, but what advice would you give?
Well, don't follow the path I followed. Because I did everything wrong and I learned everything backward. But the best thing is to begin with a stage of sort of awareness. So there's so much you can learn about how stories work already, right? So how do stories flow in conversation? How do stories move around in communities or organizations or families? There's been tons of research done on this, and I have some stuff that you can read about it, and lots of other people do too. But there's things you can learn about how stories work that you just start noticing them. Once you've learned a little bit, you start saying, hey, that person just told a story. You can one of the things I always tell people is go sit in a cafe and just listen. And you can hear all the stories sort of popping off all around you.
Yeah.
And you can hear not just the stories, but the chains of stories and the interactions surrounding the stories and the whole negotiation process. It's absolutely fascinating once you kind of tap into what's going on. So that's kind of the first stage, is just to become aware of what's going on. And then the second stage I would call sort of tweaking, where you just sort of start trying little things, little experiments, right? So for example, a long time ago when I was learning all this stuff, I went to a craft fair. And there was this woman who had these little birdhouses made out of gourds. And I just spontaneously said, so how did you get started making birdhouses out of gourds? And her face just lit up. And she just was like, oh, and she told me the whole story. And I must have made her day. And it was so exciting that I just started doing it all the time. That if you ask people questions that whose answers are stories, you've just given them permission. You've just basically invited them to give you that little package.
Ah,
And people love doing that. And I found that it's really fun to just meet people and say, so how did, and just come up with a question. And then they love it usually. And then you go back and forth. And so the tweaking stage, I think, is where you just start playing with it. You just see what you can do. And then the third stage is, once you've done that for a while, you start to become hungry to do a project, where you start thinking, what could I do? Could I bring these people together in a room? Maybe I could do one of these crazy little exercises. There's lots of exercises. There's some that I have, but look, many people have exercises related to working with stories.
mhm.
Everybody in our field has these different exercises and things. And it is not that hard to do them. You just have to practice, and you get better at it. And then you just keep going, and it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I love it. This has been such a joy talking with you.
Me too.
And I'm looking at the clock, and I can't believe we're running out of time. But I'm just going to say one small thing before I hand it off to you to do some final words. You said there are a lot of practices, and some of the simplest practices are getting people. Let's say you're talking to a team who has an objective, and to take one of the words out of the objectives and say, what is, when you look at that word, what story in your mind? What is it stimulating your mind? And tell that story. And I have done this again and again and again with groups, even with audiences. And all of a sudden that word blossoms, and it means so much more. And people, then they really appreciate the subtleties. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I know I have to move to your final words, or we will run out of time. So thank you so much, Cynthia. But do you have any final words for my audience?
I guess my final words are that I really encourage people to just check out the work of anybody who does work with stories, because it's all good. There's a load of people doing it. Madeline, you're one of them. And the more you can learn about it, the more you can sort of partake in this whole thing that people do. And it's just a really nice way to connect, to connect with people, to think about things, and to communicate with people.
Yeah.
And I just encourage people to try it.
Great.
That's what I have to say.
Cynthia, thank you so much. I will also say to our audience, it's a great way to get to know people and network. So,
Yes,
if
it is.
nothing else, it does indeed. All right. Well, again, Cynthia, thank you so much. I loved. I'm taking away from today that narrative includes knowledge and explaining things. It's more than story. It's lots of things in there. So I want to thank you for that. All right. Let's see where we are. What a fascinating conversation. I knew it would be, because I know Cynthia, and she has done amazing, amazing work. But before Cynthia joined me, you will recall that the leaders of NASA were just approaching Ed. I mean, he had just done this story project at NASA. So what did they say to him? Let's listen.
And I remember the first one saying, "We want to thank you for this." Thank you. He said, it was a wonderful experience, but really what happened is, usually when we come together, we bring other people who are gurus and experts to share their knowledge with us.
Yeah.
Basically, what this is about, you're acknowledging that we have our own gurus and experts who can share their lessons together. So it was a switch. I never forgot that. When you give a person a chance to tell a story, you're acknowledging them for who they are. And it has such power, not only for learning and taking time to reflect, but belonging. It's the ultimate act of respect when I want to hear your story.
Yes. Yes. And belonging is so related to, am I heard?
Yes.
Am I seen and am I heard? Yeah.
And who's heard and who's not heard in the society, who's heard and not heard in the team. You can get the question of what's a sign in 1 minute. What's the sign of a successful team?
Now, I'm sure that among those people, there were those who are more introverted. I can just see a lot of scientists really being introverted. They're very focused on what they're doing. Did stories break through that barrier?
I think so. I have to tell you, Madeline, I didn't see of all the things that we did in terms of learning, development, different activities, the story piece was probably the most natural. I wouldn't say easy, because easy sounds like you just turn it on, but I think it was the most natural. I never saw a person who couldn't tell a story. I saw people who initially they would be embarrassed, oh, I can't think of anything. And you give them a couple minutes and you give a couple of examples and they come to it. There's some people, of course, who are great oral storytellers, just like there are those who are great at writing. But what we found is that we can work with anyone. And really everyone wanted to share when they saw their story.
Yeah.
So I think it's a human need. I think it's maybe not as important as getting air, but from a standpoint of socializing and culture and building how we relate to each other, we tell stories. What's it like to work with Ed? What's it like to work with Madeline? What's the podcast like? What's their style? We tell stories, and that creates a sense of what the culture is. And when we want to change that culture, I think we have to look at the stories and say, well, maybe it's not getting us where we want to go.
From what you're saying, you never talked about a story and what makes up a story. Yeah. You just said, tell a story about, and then you gave them some really good, what I call roots, a project that was really challenging. Okay. Well, I was so surprised when Ed said they came up and they thanked him. What a great affirmation of what he was trying to do there. You know, we all know that story can move our feelings. Now we know that is how we think, and it influences how we act. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unlocked. And if you did, make a comment on social media about what you learned and might do differently as a result. And if you're on YouTube, click the like button, share it, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.